She looked straight at the judge, then smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't need a room to be large to fill it. She said, "Your Honor, before you waste this court's time, let me save everyone the trouble." She pointed directly at me. "My husband spent 30 years pretending to be someone important. He's just another washed-up veteran living off old stories." A few people laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Even her attorney couldn't hide a smile. He looked down at his notepad, but the corners of his mouth were already there. I never looked at her. My eyes were already on the judge, because I recognized him immediately. 26 years changes a man's face. It does not change his eyes. He looked back at me, froze, 10 seconds, 15. He slowly stood up, removed his glasses, raised one trembling hand, and quietly said, "Permission to speak freely. Colonel?" Every sound inside that courtroom disappeared. "My name is Colonel James Harlow, retired, 29 years of service," and the woman who had just called me washed up had no idea that the man sitting behind that bench was the same lieutenant I had carried across 40 yards of open ground in Afghanistan, while bullets tore the dirt around my feet. This is that story. I want to tell you about Claire before I tell you about the courtroom, because she deserves to be understood before she is judged, and because the full picture of 23 years is more complicated than what happened on a Tuesday morning in March. We met when I was 31. She was 28. I was between deployments, stationed in Virginia, attending a conference I had been sent to because my commanding officer believed I needed, in his exact words, to spend some time around civilians before I forgot how to be one. She was at the same hotel for a work event. We ended up at the same table at the bar because every other seat was taken, and we talked for 3 hours about things I cannot now fully remember, but which felt, at the time, like the most important conversation I had ever had with someone I had known for less than a day. She was sharp, funny in the dry, understated way that I have always found more convincing than performance. She had opinions, and she had the confidence to hold them, even when someone pushed back, which I tested twice that evening just to see. She passed both times. I knew before I went back to my room. We married 14 months later. The early years were good, the way early years in military marriages often are, with an intensity that comes from knowing that the time together is limited, and therefore chosen, and therefore precious. She understood what she was marrying. I had been clear about that from the beginning. The deployments, the absences, the particular way that 20 years of service shapes a person into someone who is sometimes easier to read in uniform than out of it. She said she understood. For a long time she did. But understanding something in the abstract and living it for 2 decades are different exercises entirely. And somewhere in the middle of our marriage, the gap between what she had understood and what she was actually experiencing became too wide to maintain with the effort available. I do not blame her entirely for that. I was not always easy to be married to. I know this about myself with the specific clarity of someone who has had considerable quiet time to examine it. I am private by nature and by training. I process things internally and reveal them selectively, which, in a professional context, is a strength, and in a marriage is something considerably more complicated. I came home from deployments, carrying things I had no language for and no inclination to translate. Claire waited at the door of a house where I was physically present and somewhere else in every other sense. She waited with patience that was real and that had limits, as all patience does, and by the time those limits were reached, the distance between us had become structural rather than temporary. We tried counseling twice, long conversations that started honestly and ended somewhere we both agreed to call resolution. 2 people who had invested 23 years in something and were not ready to concede that it had run its course. But there is a point in some marriages where the effort itself becomes the relationship, where what you are doing is no longer building something, but maintaining the appearance of something. And I think we both knew when we crossed that point. The difference was that Claire knew it first. She told me, on a Wednesday evening in October, we were in the kitchen. She said it clearly, without drama, with the directness I had always admired in her. She had thought about it for a long time. She was not asking for my opinion about whether it was the right decision. I said, "All right." She said, "That's all you have to say?" I said, "What else would you like me to say?" She looked at me with an expression I had seen many times over 23 years and had never fully decoded. Then she said, "Nothing. I suppose nothing." And we began the process. I want to be honest about what happened between October and March. The divorce, in theory, should not have been contentious. We had a house, paid off, which I had bought with money, saved over years of deployments, and the financial discipline of someone who has never spent much on himself. We had savings. We had 2 adult children who handled the news with the complex maturity of people who have seen something coming and are not entirely surprised by its arrival. There was no structural reason for what happened next, but marriages do not always end according to structural reason. Somewhere between the first lawyer's letter and the court date, something in Claire shifted, or something in the people around her shifted, or the combination of grief and anger, and the particular way that divorce forces people to construct arguments for positions they may not have fully held before the arguments were required. The house became the center of it. She wanted it, which was reasonable. She had lived in it for 16 years, made it what it was, and had a legitimate claim to it that I had always been willing to honor. But Claire's attorney, a man named Garrett, who was capable and theatrical in roughly equal measure, filed documentation that went considerably beyond the house. He filed character assessments, statements constructed to suggest that my military salary had been the minor financial contribution in the marriage, that the savings were largely attributable to Claire's income during my deployments, and that the overall pattern of our life together showed a man who had consistently prioritized his career over his family. Some of this was technically defensible, some of it required creative accounting to support. But the part I found most difficult to sit with was not the financial argument, it was the portrait. Garrett had constructed a picture of a man who collected medals and attended dinners and called it service, who had used a uniform as an excuse for absence, who had come home from deployments emotionally unavailable and asked to be treated as a hero for it. I read this documentation alone in the apartment I had rented after October. A small apartment, functional, the kind that exists as a transition rather than a home. I sat with the documents, and I thought about 23 years and what they had actually contained, and I thought about the parts the documents had included and the considerable parts they had not. They had not included the deployment to Bosnia in 1999, when I was gone for 11 months, and came back to find that Claire had managed everything alone, with 2 children under 8, without a single complaint that I can recall. They had not included the 3 years at a desk job in Washington, when I could have taken a field position that would have advanced my career significantly, and I chose not to, because we had agreed it was time for me to be home. They had not included the offer in 2008, the position that would have been the summit of a certain kind of career, that I turned down because Claire had told me, quietly and without pressure, that she needed me present for a while. I turned it down. I was present, and it was still not enough. That is not a complaint. It is simply true. I told my attorney, Robert Finch, a steady man who had handled my legal affairs for a decade, that I did not want to file counter-documentation, that I did not want to respond to character assessments with character assessments of my own, that I wanted the divorce to end with as little damage as possible. Robert said, "James, they are going to say these things in court." I said, "I know." He said, "And you don't want me to respond to them." I said, "Respond to the financial claims. Leave the rest." He looked at me. He said, You know what it's going to sound like. I said, I know exactly what it's going to sound like. He said, then why? I said, because the people who matter already know who I am, and the people in that courtroom are not the people who matter. He said, all right, the tone of a man who disagrees and respects the decision anyway. And on a Tuesday morning in March, we went to court. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I have been in many rooms where significant things happened, and they have rarely looked like what the movies suggest. This one was ordinary: beige walls, fluorescent lighting, wooden benches behind the partition holding perhaps 20 people, most of them waiting for their own proceedings. Claire was already seated when I arrived with Robert. She was dressed carefully. She did not look at me when I came in. Garrett leaned toward her and said something quiet, and she nodded. I sat down. I looked at the bench. The judge had not yet entered. I looked around the room the way I look at any room, methodically. The arrangement of people, the exits, the sight lines. Old habit, the kind that does not switch off. Then the judge came in. He was perhaps 62, broad through the shoulders, in the way of a man who was once considerably broader and has carried the frame into age. He walked with a slight list to the left that I recognized as an old injury, accommodated rather than corrected. Silver hair, a face that had the particular quality of someone who has spent decades in rooms where people's worst moments are put on official display, and who has maintained his decency through it by some private discipline. He sat down. He arranged his papers. He looked up, and he looked at me. 26 years changes a man's face. It does not change his eyes. His name was Daniel Brooks. He had been a first lieutenant the last time I saw him. He was 27 years old and bleeding from a head wound and barely conscious when I reached him, in a village outside Kandahar, in the winter of 2003. He was now the Honorable Judge Daniel Brooks of the Fourth Circuit Court, and he was looking at me the way you look at someone you have not seen in more than 2 decades, in a place you never expected to see them, while your entire nervous system tries to reconcile the collision of then and now. I looked back at him. I did not react. I did not nod. I held my face, the way I have held my face in difficult rooms for 29 years. The proceedings began. Garrett gave an opening statement that was polished and precise, and painted the portrait of a marriage in which one party had been consistently present and one consistently absent. Robert gave a shorter, more factual counter. Claire was called to the stand. She was composed. She spoke about the marriage in terms that were not entirely inaccurate and not entirely complete, which is the nature of testimony from a position of conflict. Then Garrett asked her to characterize me, not our marriage. Me. She looked straight at the judge, then smiled. She said, Your Honor, before you waste this court's time, let me save everyone the trouble. She pointed directly at me. My husband spent 30 years pretending to be someone important. He's just another washed-up veteran living off old stories. The courtroom laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Garrett smiled at his notepad. I watched Judge Brooks when she said it. His pen stopped moving. He looked at me. He did not look away. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Garrett finally cleared his throat. Your Honor? The judge ignored him. The bailiff looked confused. The court reporter had stopped typing. Claire frowned. Is something wrong? The judge slowly stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked directly at me. Then, without another word, he removed his glasses. He raised one trembling hand, and he saluted. Claire's attorney froze mid-sentence. Claire turned in her chair, stared. The room was completely, absolutely silent. I looked at Daniel Brooks for a long moment. Then I said quietly, at ease. He sat back down. He said, I need to make a disclosure to both parties and to the record. Before I tell you what the judge said, I need to take you somewhere else. Afghanistan. Winter of 2003. Visibility almost zero. Our convoy was moving through a valley outside Kandahar on a route we had cleared twice before. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual in the intelligence we had been given. The first explosion destroyed the lead vehicle. The second came 40 seconds later and trapped 6 men under burning steel. Enemy fire came from high ground on both sides, the kind of crossfire that makes calculation impossible and instinct the only thing left. Air support couldn't reach us. The weather had closed the valley. Radio communications were gone after the second explosion. Every survival manual written by people who have never been in that valley says retreat, consolidate, preserve remaining personnel. I gave the opposite order. Nobody gets left behind. 3 of our men were already clear. 3 were not. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks was the furthest in, partially buried under a section of collapsed vehicle, bleeding from his head, barely conscious, calling out in a voice that was getting quieter. I went in. The distance between our position and his was 40 yards of open ground. I know this because I counted every step afterward in the way you count things that nearly kill you, so they do not become abstract. I reached him. He was heavier than he looked, the way unconscious people always are. I got him across my shoulders. I started back. Bullets hit the dirt to my left, then my right. A round tore through my shoulder. I felt it as pressure first, which is how it always feels when the adrenaline is fully present, and then as heat, and then as something I filed away for later, because later was the only place I could afford to put it. Another round took out the radio on my belt. I never let go of him. At the helicopter, he was coming in and out. He kept trying to say something. I couldn't make out the words. I told him to be quiet. I told him his job was staying alive, and my job was getting everyone home, and that the division of responsibilities was working fine, so he should stop trying to renegotiate it. He almost laughed. Through the blood and the cold and whatever else was happening in his body, he almost laughed. I handed him off to the medics. I went back for the other 2. The shoulder I dealt with the following morning. The fractured rib I did not know about for 2 weeks, because I did not go to medical until the pain became operationally inconvenient. My commanding officer was not pleased with this decision. He expressed his displeasure in language I will not reproduce here. I was given a medal. I asked for the paperwork to be processed quietly. I came home. I filed it away. Some things you do not think about afterward, not because they weren't real, because thinking about them does not change them, and not thinking about them does not diminish them, and the work in front of you is always more useful than the work behind you. I had not thought about that valley in years, until I sat down in a courtroom in March and looked at the bench and saw Daniel Brooks looking back at me. Judge Brooks spoke to the clerk in the precise language of legal procedure. He established what he was about to do, and why. Both parties were given the option to request a different judge. Neither party requested a different judge. Claire's attorney looked like he was calculating something very quickly and had not yet arrived at a number. Then the judge said, "I am going to read something into the record." He lifted a paper from his bench. He said, "Colonel James Harlow, 29 years of service, 3 deployments to active conflict zones, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 with Valor. The second Bronze Star with Valor was awarded for the extraction of wounded personnel under direct enemy fire, resulting in injuries to Colonel Harlow that required surgical intervention." He paused. He said, "The court is also in possession of information that has emerged through standard discovery processes and which I am required to address." He lifted a second document. He said, "During these proceedings, the following financial records were identified." He nodded to Helen, the court clerk, a woman I had not paid particular attention to until this moment. Helen placed a folder in front of Claire. Claire opened it. First page. Veteran Scholarship Fund. $420,000. Anonymous donor. She turned the page. Children's Burn Hospital. $380,000. She turned again. Military Widow Foundation. Anonymous. She kept turning. Another page. Another. 6 pages. 7. She stopped turning. She looked at the donations the way you look at something when your mind is trying to do 2 things at once. Process what is in front of you and process what it means, and cannot fully accomplish either. Every signature carried my name. Nobody knew where my retirement went. Every bonus, every consulting payment, every investment that had matured over decades of careful, unspectacular patience, not into luxury, not into anything visible, into scholarships for the children of veterans who would not have gone to university otherwise, into burn centers because I know what burns cost and what the funding gap costs the people inside those units, into housing for military widows because I understood what it meant to have the structure of a military life removed without adequate preparation for what replaces it. Every single donation. Anonymous. All of it. Until this folder. Claire sat very still. The tears came without announcement. She did not make a sound. They simply appeared and ran down her face in the specific way of someone who did not plan to cry and has no plan for stopping. Her attorney slowly closed his own folder. The bailiff looked at the floor. The people in the gallery who had laughed 20 minutes earlier could not meet my eyes. The silence was not uncomfortable anymore. It was something else. It was the specific silence of a room full of people who have just understood that they fundamentally misread what they were looking at. Judge Brooks let it hold for a moment. Then he spoke. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen." He did not look at his papers. He said, "Today, you believed you were watching a divorce hearing. You were actually watching something far more important. You were watching how easily the world forgets its quiet heroes." He looked at me. He said, "The man sitting before you once carried 6 soldiers out of a burning battlefield. He carried them across open ground while the ground was being fired upon. He sustained injuries, doing so that he did not report for 2 weeks because the work in front of him seemed more pressing than the damage behind him." He paused. He said, "One of the men he carried that day was me." He let that sit. He said, "He never asked for recognition for it. He processed the paperwork quietly, as he apparently processes everything quietly, and he returned to his unit the following morning." He said, "Today he did not ask for recognition either. He sat at that table, and he listened to a characterization of his service that was—" He paused, and in the pause you could hear him choosing the precise word, "incomplete," and he said nothing, because he has never needed a room to tell him who he is. He looked at the gallery. He said, "I have sat on this bench for 14 years. I have heard a great many things said in this courtroom about a great many people. What was said this morning about Colonel Harlow is the statement I will remember longest, for the specific reason that it was the most wrong." He looked at Claire's attorney. Garrett did not look up. He looked at Claire. She was still looking at the folder in front of her, one hand flat on the open page, the other hand in her lap. He said, "These proceedings will be concluded with full accuracy. The financial record as disclosed will be entered in its entirety. The court thanks both parties for their attendance today." He reached for his gavel. He stopped. He looked at me one more time. He said, "Colonel." I said, "Your Honor." He said, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome, Daniel." It was the first time I had used his name. The gavel came down. The proceedings concluded that afternoon. The outcome was fair. Not dramatically in my favor, not dramatically in Claire's. The kind of fair that comes from complete information, replacing incomplete information, and the adjustments that follow, being honest rather than constructed. Robert told me in the parking lot that I had done better than he expected, given how the morning had started. I told him I had gotten exactly what I came for. He said, "Which was?" I said, "An ending." He shook my hand. He got in his car. He drove away. I stood in the parking lot. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I turned around. Daniel Brooks. No robe. Just a man. He was wearing a grey coat, and he had his glasses in his hand, and he walked toward me with the slight list to the left that I had noticed from the bench, and that I now understood, as I had understood it then, in Afghanistan, as simply the price of something that had happened and been survived. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at me the way you look at someone when words have been insufficient for 26 years, and you are not confident they have become sufficient now. He said, I tried to find you, in the early years. I said, I moved around. He said, I know. I lost the trail in 2007. I said, I was in Iraq in 2007. He said, I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the burn center at Bethesda. I said, yes. He said, the expansion in 2016. I said, among others. He said, James. I said, it was the right place to put it. That's all. He said, that is not all. I said, it's all I have to say about it. He looked at me for a long moment, the look of someone who has a complete thought and is deciding whether the words available to him are adequate to carry it. He decided they weren't. He straightened. He raised his hand. One final salute, clean, precise. The salute of someone who learned it under someone else's command and has never let the form deteriorate. He said, thank you, Colonel. I smiled. Go home to your family, Daniel. He nodded. He lowered his hand. He walked back toward the courthouse. I turned to my truck. Same old pickup, same faded paint, same quiet life. I opened the door. I started the engine. I checked the mirror before pulling out. He was still standing at the courthouse entrance, still saluting. I drove away. 3 weeks after the proceedings concluded, Claire called me. I was in the apartment. Early evening. I answered. She said, James. I said, Claire. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I went through the folder again. All of it. I said, all right. She said, I want to ask you something. I said, go ahead. She said, why didn't you tell me? About any of it. The foundation, the donations, any of it. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, because it wasn't about you. She said, we were married for 23 years. I said, I know, but this was separate from the marriage. It was about what I needed to do with what I had, separately from everything else. She said, why separately? I said, because if I told you, it became something we talked about, something we shared, and I needed it to be something I simply did, without it being a topic, without it being part of how anyone thought about me, including you. She was quiet. She said, that's the most you sentence I've ever heard. I said, I know. She said, it's also, now that I think about it, the most... She stopped. James, in that courtroom, when he stood up, when he saluted. I said, yes. She said, I said those things about you. I said, you said what you believed. She said, I believed things that were... She stopped again. I was wrong about what you were, not about the marriage. The marriage was what it was, and I stand by wanting to end it. But about what you were. I said, you weren't entirely wrong. She said, I was wrong about the important parts. I said, some of them. She said, James, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, that's all you're going to say. I said, what else would you like me to say? She was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, she said, nothing. I suppose nothing. The same words. Third time in 23 years. Each time in a different room. Each time the same answer. I said, take care of yourself, Claire. She said, you too. We hung up. I sat in the apartment for a while. Then I made dinner. That was 14 months ago. The apartment is still where I live. It has stopped feeling like a transition. I have added things to it that make it feel like mine. A bookshelf I built from reclaimed wood over 3 weekends that turned out better than I expected. A photograph of a mountain range I cannot precisely identify, but that looks like a place I spent 3 weeks in once, and remember as the most honest terrain I have ever seen. The divorce is finalized. My children call regularly, my son on Sunday evenings, my daughter on Wednesday mornings. I did not ask them to call on these schedules. They arrived at them independently, which is the best kind of schedule. My son, when he had the full picture of what had happened in the courtroom, said, "Dad, why didn't you tell us about the foundation?" I said, "Would it have changed anything?" He said, "For us? No, but for how people saw you." I said, "That's why I didn't tell you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I understand." I said, "I know you do. Daniel Brooks and I have had dinner 3 times. He has a wife who is a cardiologist and who speaks about her work with the specific passion of someone for whom the work is genuinely the point. He has 2 daughters, both in their 20s, both apparently as direct as their father. He drinks his coffee too strong. He has opinions about food that are more considered than the situation usually requires. He is good company. At our second dinner, he said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "When you went back in, the second time, for the other 2, after you'd already been hit, what were you thinking?" I thought about that. "Honestly," I said, "nothing specifically. Nothing that would make a coherent sentence." He said, "But something." I said, "Something like, there are still 2 people in there. That's all. Not a thought exactly. More like a direction." He said, "A direction." I said, "You go in the direction of the people who need you to. That's the whole calculation." He said, "That's the whole calculation." I said, "That's all there is." He looked at his coffee. He said, "I built a career out of what happened in that valley. 14 years on the bench. I went to law school because of it. Because I wanted to spend my life in rooms where what was true mattered, where the difference between what was real and what was constructed had official weight." I said, "That seems right." He said, "It came from you." I said, "It came from you. I just gave you the time to get there." He looked at me. He said, "You're going to say that and mean it, aren't you?" I said, "It's accurate." He shook his head. He smiled. He said, 26 years, and you haven't changed." I said, "I'm considerably slower." He said, "Everything else." I said, "Everything else. Respect doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives decades later, in a courtroom, in complete silence. I did not serve to be recognized in a courtroom. I did not build a foundation to be discovered in a divorce proceeding. I did not pull Daniel Brooks across 40 yards of open ground so that 26 years later he could stand up in a judge's robe and say what was true. I did those things because they were the right things to do with what I had. The money went where it was needed, because that is what money is for, when you have more of it than you require for a quiet life in a modest apartment, with a bookshelf you built yourself, and a truck with faded paint. The work in Afghanistan was done because there were people in a building who needed to come out of it, and I was the person who could get them out. Everything followed from those 2 simple facts. Do the right thing with what you have. Go in the direction of the people who need you to. The courtroom was where someone who owed me nothing stood up and said what was true. That mattered to me. I will not pretend otherwise. But what mattered more was that I had already been who I was before he stood up, before the salute, before the silence. The salute did not make me who I am. It simply, finally, made the room aware of it. Dignity never asks to be noticed, but it always deserves to be remembered. If there is someone in your life who has served quietly, who shows up without announcement, who does the work without requiring the recognition, who goes in the direction of the people who need them to without waiting to be asked, tell them today that you see them, not in a courtroom, now, while you can. I'll see you in the next one.